Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. And for the next couple of hours, we're going to be talking about a variety of different things. Of course, we have to start off by talking about impeachment because, unfortunately, that's kind of the major news story at the moment, created in large part by an announcement made just a few minutes ago by the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. But we won't be focusing all of our time and attention on that, even over the next couple of hours or even in this whole hour. But I will start there. Do want to talk a little bit about some of the controversy that is surrounding, I think, unfortunately, the actions in the past of Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who has now begun to be criticized because there was a picture that surfaced from a couple of years ago where he was actually supporting Salvation Army. I'm going to try to put that in some kind of context, but even on my own Facebook page, I said, here's a place where he could maybe set the record straight for the good work that Salvation Army does as an individual who is identified as LBGT. Let's have him say something positive about the Salvation Army. That would certainly be good, so we'll get into that. We also have some other articles we've posted here on bad social policies. This is one by Ben Shapiro, which I think is a very good if you will, antidote to some things that Paul Krugman has put out, erroneously, by the way, in the New York Times. A piece that I posted, which I really won't get into much, but it's amazing. This survey showing that about 20% of employers said they would not hire somebody who's a Trump supporter. Oh, boy. As well as some questions raised about what happens when our guardians fail to guard us. That's a good Victor Davis Hanson piece, and a couple of others that we will get to. And all of that's this hour. Then next hour, we're going to change topics, which I'm glad we are going to do. And that is one, if you will, historian who's probably done more damage to our perception that young people have of this country, is a historian by the name of Howard Zinn. Wrote a book called A People's History of the United States. If any of you happen to be a film aficionados, you will remember in Good Will Hunting that Will Hunting, interestingly enough, spends some time promoting Howard Zinn's book. There's one place where he even criticizes some of the other historians in a bar, of all places. But anyway, we'll get into that in just a bit. So I've always felt the need to provide, again, some answers to some of this, since we've talked about this attempt so often to rewrite American history and historical revisionism, in this case by a person who definitely has Marxist leanings, is something that deserves an answer. So Mary Grabar will be with us. We'll be talking about her new book, Debunking Howard Zinn. And then even in the third hour, we'll be talking with Dean Inserra about the Unsaved Christian. It's really about cultural Christians. You know as well as I do that at Christmas time, and that's where we are right now, you'll have some people that never go to church show up at church. Well, as you get to know them, you say, even though they call themselves Christians, even though maybe twice a year, Christmas and Easter, they come to church, I really need to maybe share the gospel with them, but I don't want to do it in a way that's going to hurt their feelings because they already are convinced they're Christians. But I'm pretty sure, I'll leave that to the Lord, they're not. So we're going to be getting some insight on that as well. So there are just a lot of things that we are going to be talking about today. But I think it is important to at least start out by talking about the impeachment direction that came today, because you have the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, stood up there, spoke for just 6 minutes, took no questions, but basically said we have no choice but to act. And so right now you have a situation in which, of course, there is the impeachment inquiry. I'm going to have more to say about the first day of the second session that took place in the House Judiciary Committee, and then also some things to say about what happened in the House Intelligence Committee. But nevertheless, her comments promoting the idea and directing the various groups that are involved, primarily the House Judiciary Committee, to actually write up articles of impeachment, confirm what a lot of people expected, and that is that there will be a vote in the House of Representatives before they leave on their Christmas recess, I suspect. I can't imagine they'd wait till January, but you never know on these things. And so, again, she says, I'm asking Chairman to, sadly, with the confidence and humility, with allegiance to our founders, can I at least roll my eyes on this one, and our heartfelt love for America, today I'm asking our chairman to proceed with the articles of impeachment. So that's where we are right now. And I thought for just a minute, we might spend a moment talking about what did happen yesterday. And, of course, you had a couple of individuals that testified. I'll just mention very quickly the ones that supported the Democrats. And then when we come back from the break, I want to spend a little more time talking about some of the comments by Jonathan Turley, who is a law professor at George Washington University, a person who brought a fair amount of common sense. And again, this comes as an interesting statement from an individual that voted for Hillary Clinton, is a Democrat, and yet on a number of occasions I find myself quoting him. Most recently, I've quoted him pointing out that the fourth branch of government, that is the bureaucracy, is doing a lot more than the framers ever intended. You got to love it when you got an individual who identifies himself as a liberal, identifies himself as a Democrat, identifies himself as a Hillary supporter, nevertheless saying we're starting to get a government that's out of control, and it's pretty much being run by the bureaucrats, and that's not a good thing. So those are some comments he's made in the past, but let's at least see kind of the point-counterpoint there. The Harvard law professor Noah Feldman claimed that the founding fathers would identify President Trump's conduct as exactly the kind of abuse of office, high crimes and misdemeanors that they were worried about. He didn't give us any quotes from the Federalist Papers because I'm hard put to find anything in the Federalist Papers that do anything other than suggest that it would have to be some really extraordinary kinds of actions on the part of the president for impeachment, since the primary goal, it seems to me, for impeachment wasn't for the president, because a president could be removed every 4 years because of an election, even though it would be done by the Electoral College back then. And those individuals may not necessarily be put in that position because of a popular vote, which is, of course, what happens now. But they certainly have this idea of impeachment as at least some check and balance to the fact that you appoint federal judges for life. And so there was if you will, even a higher standard for whether you would use impeachment against a president to try to remove that president from office. And, of course, we never have removed a president from office, even when there have been a number of articles of impeachment, and there have been, in 2 cases, a trial, and a president has never been removed. But let's move on to someone else, and that's Pamela Karlan, who I've just discovered the other day was one of the individuals on the short list to be put on the Supreme Court if Hillary Clinton had been elected president. And she, of course, has had a history of criticizing the president and has called for the impeachment of the president long before there was even a discussion of the July 25th phone call, but nevertheless made a statement, which we'll come back to a little bit later, which was obviously a rehearsed joke, in which she named the son of Donald Trump Barron, and we'll get into that in just a minute. So that brings us to some of the comments we'll have by Jonathan Turley, who is a professor of law at George Washington University. Even though he was not a Trump supporter, he still spent a fair amount of time challenging the whole rationale for this impeachment inquiry. So we'll come back and talk about what he said and how that might not make the difference, but was certainly important to be presented yesterday. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The marriage rate in America has been in decline for many years. Consider that in the year 2000, the married 25 to 34-year-olds outnumbered their never-married peers. By 2015, however, those percentages were almost reversed. Young people are not getting married for a variety of reasons. Many economists argue that men are avoiding marriage because they have lower wages and want to increase their income before asking a woman to marry them. But the latest research shows that even where wages have increased dramatically, we see no appreciable change in marriage rates. Another theory is that men are fearful of commitment. Obviously, there's some truth to that, but again, we find surveys that show that men plan to get married but are content to postpone marriage. The median age of marriage for American men is now approaching 30. Sociology professor Mark Regnerus at the University of Texas has published research that explains why men are postponing marriage. It can be summarized in 2 words: cheap sex. As compared to the past, he says, many women today expect little in return for sex in terms of time, attention, commitment, or fidelity. Men do not feel compelled to supply these goods as they once did. He also adds one other explanation: pornography. Online porn, he says, has made sexual experience more widely and easily available too. A laptop never says no, and for many men, virtual women are now genuine competition for real partners. When many of us were growing up, we sometimes heard our mothers or grandmothers warn young girls about giving themselves away. They ask, why buy a cow when you can get the milk for free? This recent study confirms what they were telling their daughters years ago. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Right, once again, let me, if I can, for just a few more minutes, talk about a few things that came from the first day of the second round of impeachment hearings, and I'll get into that in more detail in just a minute. But a couple of quotes from Jonathan Turley, again, a professor at George Washington University's law school, and he said, if the House proceeds solely on the Ukrainian allegations, this impeachment would stand out among modern impeachments as the shortest proceeding with the thinnest evidentiary record and the narrowest grounds ever used to impeach a president. I'll come back to that in just a minute because there was an interesting back and forth between one of the Republicans on the committee and him. But he also pointed out a little bit later that even as you are engaged in accusing the president of abusing his power, you are guilty of the same thing. Now, hypocrisy has never been a problem for certain individuals, even elected individuals, but the quote I thought was really powerful, in which he said, President Trump has gone to the courts. He's allowed to do that. We have 3 branches, not 2. If you impeach a president, if you make a high crime and misdemeanor out of going to the courts, it's an abuse of power. It's your abuse of power. You're doing precisely what you're criticizing the president for doing. So he did not only talk about how this made no sense, but how in some respects there was just a great deal of controversy around some of the actions that even the courts themselves were engaged with, the Congress were engaged with. And so I thought it was just very interesting that he made some of those statements. Good piece that came out by Fred Lucas, 6 big moments from day one of the second round. Point number 1 was what he called tears in Brooklyn. He said the Trump impeachment effort ultimately dates back, according to Representative Doug Collins, to this particular time in which there were sour grapes by the Democrats about losing an election. And he said it didn't start with Mueller, Collins said. It didn't start with a phone call. This started with tears in Brooklyn in November of 2016 when the election was lost. Kind of one of the lines there. Number two, the whole question of whether or not this impeachment inquiry would prevent us, if you will, from having a monarchy. You know, this president now has abused power. He's kind of like a king. And Michael Gerhardt, who is a law professor from the University of North Carolina School of Law, testified that he was fearful that if we weren't going to impeach President Donald Trump, that would raise the bar too high for future impeachments. If you've heard me say anything, it's just that is exactly what I think. If you read the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton in particular, and the notes of the Constitution Convention, what they wanted. They wanted it to be a very high bar. They did not want to have something that looked like what you have in various parliaments today, where you have a vote of non-confidence. And, of course, you have a little bit later the statement which was made by the Stanford law professor Pamela Karlan, who said the Constitution says there's no titles of nobility, so while the president can name his son Baron, he cannot make him a baron. And, of course, everybody laughed, and that led to, interestingly enough, an incredible interchange on social media, because Melania Trump decided she wasn't going to take that, or at least someone in her office decided they weren't going to take it, and said a minor child deserves privacy, should be kept out of politics. Pamela Karlan, you should be ashamed of yourself and all those kinds of things. And so pretty quickly then Karlan came back to the hearing and said, I want to apologize for what I said earlier about the president's son. And that was an interesting interchange that unfolded. Then we have the one that all the late night comedians wanted to have fun with, because as I mentioned just a minute ago, Jonathan Turley, who's a professor, of course, at George Washington School of Law, had a moment of levity, which I think was camped on by, you know, all of the individuals that do the shows like Jimmy Fallon last night. I saw he did, I'm sure of almost everybody else did as well, in which at one point he was saying, you know, I get it. You are mad. The president is mad. My Democratic friends are mad. My Republican friends are mad. My wife is mad. My kids are mad. Even my dog is mad. And Luna is a golden doodle and has never been mad. And so that was to really lighten up that. But it was one of the things that was picked by some of the late night comedians and talk show hosts. But nevertheless, that was one of those lines. And then, of course, you had some people questioning whether or not the use of the word bribery was even appropriate. And then we have a couple of others. We have, of course, I just mentioned a minute ago, Pamela Karlan saying, well, you know, if we had the president who actually, if there was a hurricane or, you know, for example, in Louisiana or Texas, then decide to hold up funding for that because he wanted some kind of favor, we would all think that was wrong. I think we would. But again, these are good examples of apples and oranges, because the holdup had to do, as best we can determine, with some concerns about corruption and had nothing to do with anything else. And, of course, these are very different kinds of issues, given the fact that our foreign aid is oftentimes predicated on behavior. But nevertheless, we had a couple of other individuals. But I thought I would wind down this hour of the discussion on the impeachment by having the back and forth between, interestingly enough, Representative Ken Buck, who is a Republican from Colorado, and the interaction that he had with Jonathan Turley. And so he reminded everybody that these kinds of decisions being made, if we were to apply them in the past, of course, the implication is if we apply them in the future, it's going to almost mean that almost anything a president does could possibly be impeached. So for just a minute, let's just listen to, if you can, the back and forth between Ken Buck. Because Ken Buck says, quote, Lyndon Johnson directed the Central Intelligence Agency to place a spy in the election opponent at the time, Barry Goldwater's campaign. That spy got advanced copies of speeches and other strategies, delivered that to the Johnson campaign. And so he asked Jonathan Turley, Would that be impeachable conduct according to the other panelists that you have here? Jonathan Turley says, I assume. Okay, then Ken Buck says, how about when President Johnson put a wiretap on Goldwater's campaign plane? Would that be for political benefit? Again, Jonathan Turley says, yeah, I guess I would assume that would be the case. So Ken Buck was not finished. He goes on to say, okay, let me relate to something that Ted Dorsch from Florida had said earlier, and that is about he was saying that Franklin D. Roosevelt always put the country first. Well, Ken Buck was ready for that. He says, now Franklin Roosevelt, when he was president, directed the IRS to conduct audits of his political enemies, namely Huey Long, William Randolph Hearst, Hamilton Fish, Father Charles Coughlin. Buck said, would that be abuse of power for political benefit according to the other panelist? Jonathan Turley says, yeah, I think we'd have to assume that would be the case. Okay, Ken Buck goes on. How about when President Kennedy directed his brother, that would be the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to deport one of his mistresses as an East German spy? Would that qualify as an impeachable conduct? Jonathan Turley said, I can't exclude it. Ken Buck says, well, how about when Kennedy directed the FBI to use wiretaps on congressional staffers who opposed him politically? Would that be an impeachable conduct? Turley said, well, it seems to be falling within it. Now Buck really gets tough. He said, let's go to Barack Obama. When Barack Obama directed or made a finding that the Senate was in recess and appointed people to the National Labor Relations Board and lost 9-0 at the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg voted against the president on that issue. Would that be an abuse of power? And Jonathan Turley says, well, I don't see an exclusion under their definition. And then, of course, Buck referred to Obama and the Benghazi attacks. He said, how about when the president directed his national security director and Secretary of State to lie to the American people about whether the ambassador to Libya was murdered as a result of a video or murdered as a result of a terrorist attack? Would that be an abuse of power for political benefit 17 days before the next election? And Jonathan Turley says, well, not according to my definition, but the others would have to respond on their own. The point they're making is, if I take seriously the three people that testified before me, their definition of what constitutes an impeachment, I think we could impeach virtually every president, maybe not everyone. Well, of course, they didn't even ask about Ronald Reagan and Iran-Contra and a few others. You could probably impeach almost every president of the United States. Is that what we want? I think most Americans say, no, this is not what was intended by the framers. And as much as we may dislike some of the things that Donald Trump says, it does not make any sense to impeach this president. But let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into some other topics. But I thought that first day of the second round of impeachment hearings provided some clarity, but you might not have known that unless you were listening to Point of View. And as we go to a break, let me just mention that we still have our Giving Tuesday banner up there. The reason for that is, at least at the moment, we still not have met our matching fund. So if you've always been saying, well, I'd like to support this ministry, we would appreciate it, and your dollar would be doubled. We'll be back right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, the impeachment inquiry does surface something else, and it gets back to something that we've talked about on this program before, and that is the issue of privacy, surveillance, security, and really a bigger question that even Victor Davis Hanson raises, and that is who will guard the guardians. That is actually a famous line from the Roman satirist Juvenal. Who will guard the guardians? If you're expecting Congress or the press to be the guardians of the public trust and they continually violate the public trust, where do you go? And I think he, in this particular article, raises this question. There's another very good article that shocked me because I did not know that until last night from the Wall Street Journal, in which we're starting to see this issue of surveillance of even Republicans that is unprecedented. And again, all you have to do is imagine if you were to reverse this. If some of these kinds of things were happening under, say, this administration over Democratic opponents, you can see what was happening under the Obama administration and even after President Obama left and his actual people stayed in many of those offices against the Trump administration. Victor Davis Hanson goes on for 2 pages, but I'm just going to give you the highlights. One of those is that we now know that an FBI lawyer, and before I did not report the name, but it's in the news now, Kevin Kleinsmith, altered an email which then provided an opportunity for the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, to begin to surveil and provide surveillance of Carter Page, one of the employees of the Trump campaign. Now, we've been assured by various individuals that the surveillance might have taken place anyway, but the altered email is something to think about, especially given the fact that the report from the Inspector General is coming out on Monday. Then you have another example that Victor Davis Hanson has, and that is FBI Director James Comey was fired. He leaked his own memos of private and confidential conversations with the president and all sorts of other issues that you can put there. So there's a second one. Then third, you got the 2 individuals, Lisa Page and Peter Strzok, former Comey friends and FBI subordinates. And the FBI eventually ruled that they leaked memos that maybe they are not felony, but nevertheless certainly showed all sorts of things, not the least of which is the amorous relationship between the two and all of those issues associated with that. Then number 4, you have, of course, Adam Schiff himself, who lied about a previous relationship with the so-called whistleblower and his own staff. And then you might remember we talked about how he read kind of his own version of the transcript, which was so inaccurate and misleading. He had to come back and actually say, well, that was just sort of a parody of it. No, it was something that was used to even continue moving this idea down the road. And then finally, we have the whistleblower himself, who first went to the House Intelligence Committee staff for guidance on how to lodge a complaint. The whistleblower's lawyer is known to be an anti-Trump activist who had previously boasted about the effort to remove Trump, which he had compared to a coup. And it just comes back to this question, when our guardians fail to guard us, where do we go? And that is a lead-in to one of the more surprising things to come out of the impeachment report by Adam Schiff. And the fact that this is in the report just shows you how brazen individuals are and how confident they are that the mainstream press will not cover it. Because interestingly enough, it has very significant details about phone calls made by various Republicans. First of all, the ranking minority chairperson of the Intelligence Committee, Republican David Nunes. Then also Trump attorneys Rudy Giuliani and Jay Sekulow. By the way, Jay Sekulow has been on the program with us before. Reporter John Solomon, who used to write for The Hill, and also has been the one breaking a lot of the stories about some of the misdeeds in the Russia investigation and all of that. Former Giuliani associate Lev Parnas, the White House, and a variety of others. And so what you have here is a surveillance action being taken by Adam Schiff of other Republicans. Now, again, let's just flip it around here. Let's imagine that wasn't so long ago when Republicans were in control of that committee and they were doing surveillance and getting and publishing in reports information about phone calls that Adam Schiff or other Democrats had made. Do you think that that would be a controversial issue? I hope you would say yes, although we get in this society now where some people are just going, well, just can't assume there's any privacy anymore. But, you know, if you want to see what that looks like, go to China right now, where every day facial recognition and computers are used to track virtually everybody in that country. But nevertheless, Adam Schiff at one point said, I think it is deeply concerning that at a time when the President of the United States was using the power of his office to dig up dirt on a political rival, there may be evidence that there were members of Congress complicit in that activity. In other words, that's his justification. But the justification doesn't wash because these are individuals who are supposed to talk to each other. That's what's called congressional oversight. Talking to Donald Trump's lawyer to get a complete view of what happened in Ukraine is exactly what you would expect a member of Congress to do. And now it's almost as if this is put in the report to say, maybe not only should we be impeaching the President of the United States, but maybe I should be even impeaching some of the people in the Intelligence Committee. And so, again, how did they obtain all of this? Well, apparently Adam Schiff and his committee issued a subpoena to AT&T demanding call logs for 5 numbers, including, of course, Rudy Giuliani. Then they had subsequent subpoenas to AT&T and Verizon demanding more details. And so this was apparently unknown to the Republicans. They were told of the subpoenas, yet under the rules of committee secrecy, they couldn't raise public objections. And so I suspect this may be the first time you've actually heard about that. Now, to be fair, what this includes is what are called metadata. So it doesn't actually have the recordings of what was actually said. But if nothing else, it's just an illustration again that those are individuals who are now being mentioned in this 300-page House Intelligence Impeachment Report, and a level of surveillance that is just breathtaking, quite frankly. And again, we would have to come back and say, you know, the first thing I would say is whether it's Adam Schiff, who's the chairman, or the minority chairman, Devin Nunes, they have the right to speak to whoever they like. And neither side, whether Republicans on one side or Democrats on the other side, have the authority to investigate those fellow members in that regard. And nevertheless, if he's going to release the call logs of all these Republicans, can we see the logs of all the things that he's done? Because, after all, there have been some people asking whether or not even Adam Schiff should be testifying. And if indeed they're going to release the call logs of all the Republicans, well, turnabout is fair play. How about releasing the call logs of the Democrats? So it's back to my big question. What do you do when the guardians aren't guarding the public trust? Just before we take a break, let me mention one more thing. I did mention it earlier, and that is all the LGBT community, some of the gay right activists are really coming down on Democratic presidential candidate Mayor Pete Buttigieg, because there is a picture that is now surfaced from a couple of years ago, I might add, in which he was involved in actually supporting the Salvation Army. He actually volunteered as part of what's called the Red Kettle Ring-Off, which is an annual charity that is done by the local South Bend group to raise money for the Salvation Army. And, of course, here you go once again. And if you are saying, well, that's enough to eliminate him from public office, which is ludicrous, then just think of all the other individuals I've been able to catalog, because you have, for example, Senator Cory Booker, who's also a presidential candidate, who tweeted a while back that he had visited the Salvation Army in Atlantic City and obviously supported it. You have Senator Elizabeth Warren, she's still a presidential candidate, held a signature collection for her presidential campaign at a Salvation Army in Indianapolis to help them raise funds. And if you want to even go back to a previous president, Barack Obama invited Salvation Army leaders to the Oval Office a couple of years ago. So we are once again in a situation where a couple of LGBTQ activists are saying Salvation Army is a hate group, and anybody that even rings a bell for the Red Kettle outreach is a person that might have to apologize or maybe just simply be disqualified from public office. It has gotten insane. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then in the next hour, we're going to be looking at the debunking of Howard Zinn, perhaps one of the most significant books to have had an influence on sort of the liberal socialist ideas of young people, including people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And, of course, I just mentioned Matt Damon because he quotes Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, even in Good Will Hunting, which he wrote the script for. And of course, we know a little bit more about his interest in that. And so we're going to talk about the attempt to rewrite American history to focus on all the evil and bad aspects of our history and ignore the good. We do have some very dark chapters in American history, slave trade, for example, the Indian Wars. But even the opening chapter here basically is Indians good, Columbus bad. And you go all the way through this book, going all the way up to the Vietnam War and even the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And in every case, you can probably guess who the bad guys are. They would be Christians, they would be conservatives, they would be white people. And you can always understand who the good people are, and those are the oppressed people that Howard Zinn talks about. And if you say, well, I'm not familiar with the book, well, I've got a copy of it right here, you know, and matter of fact, every time I'm in half-price books, there's just a whole row of them because people sometimes read them and then donate them. I got a more recent copy of it because it includes some of the newest chapters that he's written there. But going all the way back to 1980, all the way up to the last couple of years here, he has had a profound influence. And so we're going to spend some time really trying to debunk Howard Zinn and talk about what would be a more fair look at American history. Anyway, we're going to take a break in just a minute, but just before we do so, one of my articles is a piece by Ben Shapiro, and it, I think, illustrates the point because he's responding to Paul Krugman. You might say, who's Paul Krugman? Well, he writes for the New York Times. He's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, very bright individual. Don't doubt that. But this article is a good example of how if you just sort of hate Donald Trump, you hate conservatives, and you hate people in the red states, your mind simply loses control because the theory is really simple. The title is America's Red State Death Trap, or Death Trip, I guess I should say, because the theory is real simple. People that live in red states are getting depressed and suicide prone because red states promote depression and suicide. Okay, where do we start with this one? Let's take the first one. First of all, breaking it down by states doesn't make any sense, since I'm broadcasting right now primarily to people in the state of Texas. Can you consider the state of Texas uniform? Even Ben Shapiro says the difference between Austin and Lubbock is pretty great, right? So to just wave your hand and say, well, everybody in the red state of Texas, I mean, that you've got some people in Austin that are just like people in Berkeley or Boulder, Colorado, or whatever, and there are people in Lubbock that maybe have never even met somebody from Austin. So first of all, that makes no sense at all. Second of all, this is interesting. I hadn't even thought about it until Ben Shapiro pointed out. Paul Krugman uses the 2016 voting patterns to apply to the 1990 data, because he talks about in 1990, red states and blue states had about the same life expectancy. But some of those states hit hardest by the opioid epidemic, shifted over time from being blue to red. That would be Ohio, West Virginia, and Michigan, which, if nothing else, demonstrates that voting may have resulted from distress, not distress the other way around. But the bigger issue is simply that if you want to talk about why we have these deaths of despair, you've got to recognize that really over time, people that are especially lower income Americans have been disproportionately affected by what we might call social liberalism. In other words, they tend to be less religious. They tend to be less likely to go to church. They tend to not be involved in social institutions, which sometimes have actually been helpful, maybe even been safety nets and the rest. And a good example of that is somebody I'm finding myself quoting all the time. Maybe we should get him back on again, but he's so controversial, I sometimes fear what it would be like to even have him on the program. But he wrote a book, Charles Murray wrote a book called Coming Apart. I mentioned it 2 weeks ago. My Monday commentary mentions it again, in which he basically has said what we have is sort of this bifurcation. We have a group of individuals who are highly educated and have high income, and Charles Murray calls them Belmont. And then we have people that are less educated, lower income, and he names them Fishtown. And it turns out that you can ignore race, which is why Charles Murray gets criticized, because people say, well, the problems we're having in society are due to race. He said, no, really, it's due more to whether or not you have a college degree or a high school degree, whether you have high income or low income, whether you have better education or poor education. And it almost doesn't matter whether you're black, white, Hispanic, whatever. And he begins to point out all the issues that are involved with that. And again, the point is that some of those individuals who are in the red states are the ones that voted for Donald Trump disproportionately were the ones to support him because they recognized their life was not going in the right direction, and so the populism appealed to them. Well, anyway, the bottom line is, as Ben Shapiro does a very good job, I think, of critiquing this very seminal kind of essay, which I fear we're going to hear all the time, is the problem we have in our red states is these people have supported the policies of Donald Trump, and that's why we have greater depression, more suicide, and all the rest. But what Ben Shapiro says in the last part of his column is good decision-making and robust social institutions have a lot to do with life success. Promotion of bad decision-making and a decay of key social institutions in the name of personal freedom may seem liberating to elitists like Paul Krugman, but there are consequences to those who don't draw six-figure paychecks from Manhattan newspapers. Disdaining those who live in red states as victims of their own conservative backwardness isn't merely inaccurate, it's doubling down on stupid. So anyway, Ben Shapiro, I think, does a very good job of analyzing what was, I think, a very unfortunate, that's trying to be charitable, very unfortunate column from a man who's pretty smart, but didn't show it in that column at all. Just before we take a break, I thought I'd also mention the other one that I posted here, and that is an interesting survey that found that in this survey, which was called Let's Talk Trump, they found that 1 in 5, or 20%, of left-leaning managers who hire individuals would not hire a Trump supporter, which I thought was kind of interesting because, again, it is sort of this idea that we don't even want you in the workplace. One of the things I said as I passed this around to some of the people is, well, just don't tell people who you're going to support, because you now have at least 20% of individuals who are in the position of hiring people for their particular company or their particular business say that they would not hire a Trump supporter. Again, just simply turn that around. Imagine if all of a sudden we had people saying that I would never hire a person that supports Bernie Sanders, because after all, they're socialists. They probably wouldn't have a good work ethic. The mainstream press would be outraged at that, and I think most Americans would be outraged with that. But here, of course, on the other side, 1 in 5 won't hire Trump supporters, and I think you see kind of the trend moving in a kind of a dangerous direction. Well, let's take a break. Let me just mention that my commentary today is about decline of marriage. It's interesting how that parallels the John Stonestreet's Breakpoint commentary today about the decline of the family as well. And so we are all kind of writing about some of these really concerning and dangerous trends. And once again, it brings us back to the fact that a lot of this is not going to be solved in Washington, D.C. by politicians. It's going to come from a spiritual revival and a spiritual renewal. Let's take a break, though. We'll spend some time debunking Howard Zinn. We'll talk a little bit about unsaved Christians, and we'll get back to a conversation about some other issues in the news. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time, first of all, looking about what is happening on the various high school and college campuses around the country. If you listen to Point of View any length of time, you know that we've been very concerned about the attempt to recast American history and to focus on all of the evil acts in this country and to ignore all the positive ones. Rewriting history is something that has become almost a cottage industry, and we're going to spend some time really trying to get into one of the books that I think is most significant in that regard, and that is Howard Zinn. But a little bit later in the next hour, we'll get back into the issues in the news, because today the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, says she is directing House Democrats to proceed with articles of impeachment. And she says, sadly, with confidence and humility, with allegiance to our founders, and our heart full of love for America. Allow me to roll my eyes just a little bit there. Today, I'm asking our chairman to proceed with articles of impeachment. So we'll come back and talk about what that will mean and get into those details. But as you well know, if you listen to Point of View, starting first with Marlon Maddox when he was the host years ago, and even as I've been the host, we wanted to talk about what is happening in the classroom. And that is, I think, absolutely key. And a while back, I wrote a commentary in which I was pointing out the fact that this is not by accident. A man by the name of Antonio Gramsci, kind of the father of cultural Marxism, has really wanted to have this long march to the institutions. And even as we talked about the 1619 Project of the New York Times, that is part of it. And so even back in September, I was quoting from some people that had done a critique of Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, pointing out the falsehoods, the omissions, the lack of evidence, sometimes the logical fallacies, even the plagiarism that was taking place. And more recently, I came to realize that there is a book called Debunking Howard Zinn. As a matter of fact, I've quoted from Mary Grabar before, simply because we were talking about some of those issues in the book when we were approaching Thanksgiving. So I wanted to spend some time, if we can, hearing from her today. Dr. Grabar is a resident fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, also the founder of the Dissident Professor Education Project, holds a PhD from the University of Georgia, has actually taught in a number of colleges, more recently Emory University, has published in the Federalist, where I think I've seen her, of course, Town Hall, where I've seen some of her pieces as well, Front Page Magazine, City Journal, and joins us now by phone. Mary, it is a delight to have you on the program with us today.
Well, it's a delight for me. Thank you for having me.
I might also mention that you were born in Slovenia. At that time, I guess it was Yugoslavia. We love all the friends and people that we've gotten to know over the years from Slovenia, whether it's the First Lady, Melania Trump, or whether it's the Western Conference Player of the Month, Luka Doncic. And, of course, many of my colleagues make their way to Slovenia. I, of course, go to Hungary every year. And next time I'm going to Budapest, Hungary, I'm going to make sure I go to your country of Slovenia, and especially that wonderful coast in Croatia. So if nothing else, just great to hear from you. And to spend some time talking about this, I'll hold up my copy for those of you watching online. This is my copy of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. This one has about 700 pages. But talk about why you felt that it was so important to write an entire book on debunking Howard Zinn.
Well, I started writing about Howard Zinn around 2008 while he was still alive. He died in 2010. And at the time, I was still teaching, and I was appalled by what was happening in education. I'd gone through graduate school, you know, the highly politicized departments, and gotten through that, and so was also freelance writing. And then I was asked to write a report and present it in 2010 after Howard Zinn died and his FBI files were released as a result of a request by Cliff Kincaid. And I wrote a report that was probably 25 pages long, and I was approached to write a full-length book, and I felt one should be written. There have been a number of people who have fumed and justifiably gotten very angry at his very negative, distorted picture of the history of this country, but never took the time to go through it page by page. That fell through, and I couldn't find another publisher until I was asked in 2017 by someone I had been in contact with before, and was able to thankfully get a contract with Regnery, which has been wonderful to work with. And I've just felt all along that there was so much in the book. It almost seemed like an overwhelming task. I think that's why, nobody sat down to write it. It's also a very dirty job in terms of scholarship. There, you feel like throwing the book down in disgust after you see lie after lie. Once you start, looking at his sources, looking at the evidence, comparing it to legitimate history books. And, it's just something that you just want to, throw away. But you can't do that because there are almost 3 million copies that have been sold, and it's being used in classrooms, K through 12 and college.
And again, I think the point I would make is some people might say, well, I've never heard of Howard Zinn. Have you ever seen the movie Good Will Hunting? Because what you have there is a situation in which Will is a genius. It turns out both in math and history. And of course, a lot of the focus is on math, but he actually sees the book History of the United States, comments about it in that a little bit later when they're in the bar and he's challenging this guy who's trying to impress everybody with his view of history. He cites some of that again. So whether it's something that it gets a mention in that particular movie, or whether it is really a book that has been seminally involved in maybe changing the mindset of people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or even now that you have kind of a children's version of this book has had more impact, I think, in turning young people away from American exceptionalism, turning them away from the idea of a free market economy, believing that the source of evil in the world is Western civilization in America. So this is why I really wanted to spend some time talking about the book with you today. And since we're coming to a break, let me just mention that we have information about the book on the website. So if you find yourself saying, maybe I've heard a little bit about this, or I'm really disturbed about the kinds of things that are being taught in the classrooms today, maybe even in your child's high school classroom, but certainly as we come to Christmas break, you're going to have some young people coming back from the university. They're going to be saying some things, and you're going to be going, what? Where did you get that? And they may not even know the name Howard Zinn, but that's where those ideas are coming from. And if you say, okay, I want an antidote to that, I want to know if there's a way to respond to some of that, this is why I wanted you to know about this book published by Regnery, Debunking Howard Zinn. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we've provided a link so that you can get it either in hardcover or paperback. And so that information is on our website, pointofview.net. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about Howard Zinn and the way in which, in every single case, it's the white people and capitalists are the bad guys. We'll come back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The marriage rate in America has been in decline for many years. Consider that in the year 2000, the married 25 to 34-year-olds outnumbered their never-married peers. By 2015, however, those percentages were almost reversed. Young people are not getting married for a variety of reasons. Many economists argue that men are avoiding marriage because they have lower wages and want to increase their income before asking a woman to marry them. But the latest research shows that even where wages have increased dramatically, we see no appreciable change in marriage rates. Another theory is that men are fearful of commitment. Obviously, there's some truth to that, but again, we find surveys that show that men plan to get married but are content to postpone marriage. The median age of marriage for American men is now approaching 30. Sociology professor Mark Regnerus at the University of Texas has published research that explains why men are postponing marriage. It can be summarized in 2 words: cheap sex. As compared to the past, he says, many women today expect little in return for sex in terms of time, attention, commitment, or fidelity. Men do not feel compelled to supply these goods as they once did. He also adds one other explanation: pornography. Online porn, he says, has made sexual experience more widely and easily available too. A laptop never says no, and for many men, virtual women are now genuine competition for real partners. When many of us were growing up, we sometimes heard our mothers or grandmothers warn young girls about giving themselves away. They ask, why buy a cow when you can get the milk for free? This recent study confirms what they were telling their daughters years ago. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Mary Grabar, and again, her book is entitled Debunking Howard Zinn, published by Regnery. We have information about it on our website, and I would encourage you to read it, or especially get a copy if you have a young person that's maybe imbibed a little bit too much of some of the things in Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. You know, Mary, when we talk about American history, we recognize there are 2 very dark chapters. One are the Indian Wars, and, of course, just the whole issue of Native American Indians. The other one is slavery. But one of the reasons that I wanted to especially talk about this book is around the time of Thanksgiving or around the time of Columbus Day, you get all of the stories that Howard Zinn has spent and taught about in terms of, as you say in Chapter 1, Columbus bad, Indians good. Now, there were some very awful things that were done by some of the men surrounding Columbus, but there's seemingly an inability by Howard Zinn to acknowledge that Christopher Columbus was disturbed by some of the things that took place, and in a sense to put at his feet all the evils that took place because of the way in which Native Americans were treated because of his discovery of the New World. Your thoughts?
Well, yeah. I mean, there is, no one is exempt from sin, and Howard Zinn presents the world in a Manichaean sense. There are the good guys and then the bad guys, and the good guys are the Indians, and they're Indians whether they're in the Bahamas or in the American Southwest. Even if they're a warrior tribe, they're universally peaceful, they're generous, they're sharing. They respect women. Women have power. The Europeans, on the other hand, are all universally evil. They're motivated by greed, and they will murder and torture in their zeal to acquire riches to get gold. And so that's the cartoonish version of history. And, we have to admit that the Europeans weren't angels, but nor were the Indian tribes. And, and if you want to weigh it, and you can't generalize about all the tribes because there was a big diversity. I mean, there are over 500 recognized tribes, in the United States, and they're not all the same. But, I described some of the practices of the Indian tribes themselves. They were always going after each other's territory. They were raiding villages. They would take the women and the children. They would torture the men, the warriors, and often engage in cannibalism after they had killed them. I mean, and this is not to say that the Europeans didn't do anything bad, but there is, blame to go all around. Howard Zinn, however, presents this false picture of the Indians as being these kind of proto-hippies, what the hippies wanted to be, where they would live in communes and no one would fight, everyone would share equally, they'd live peacefully. Of course, that never worked out. But Howard Zinn, taking off from Marx, presents this vision of this kind of Garden of Eden that was here in America before the Europeans came. And, that's filtered down from Marx through, William Z. Foster, who was the leader, the chairman of the Communist Party USA back in 1951 when Howard Zinn was a member of the party. So it's, I think the Europeans are unique in that they feel guilt about this. I doubt that if you had asked any of the Indian warriors of the time if they felt guilty, that they would say that they felt any twinge of guilt. So, if you want to make the argument that, in that sense, Westerners were, had a superior moral sense, I would agree with that.
And just real quickly before we move on to another topic, let's just take the Aztecs as a good example, because at least to give him credit, he did say that there was ritual killing of thousands of people as sacrifices to the gods. And you point out that, that's children, slaves, prisoners of war, hearts cut out. Again, this may be during lunch, so I don't want to get into how gross all that is. But think of the most awful stuff that possibly could happen. And then for Howard Zinn, although he mentions it in passing, that didn't really make much difference. And so this idea that all these Indian tribes, or we'll use the Aztecs for just a minute, engaged in some of the most horrific practices that get, I'll give him credit, and it's only partial credit, scant mention, I think illustrates your point that always when we can find something that was done by these individuals, and let's face it, anybody that was willing to get on a ship, whether it's with Columbus or Cortez or Pizarro, whatever, probably not the elite part of our society anyway, and probably were engaging in all sorts of things that should not have happened. But when they're always described as evil, and you have this sort of idyllic utopian view of what North America and South America was like, that just simply is not a good way to cover the history, is it?
No, it's not. And while you were mentioning the Aztecs, I think the words that he uses, that there was a certain innocence in it. And I think the distinction is that right? Am I remembering?
You're right. You're correct. He says there was an innocence. I left that out just because I was trying to be fair, but it was just not innocent. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, and so it was part of their religious practices. And of course, they want to maintain dominance, over territory, which is, a primal human motivation. From time immemorial, people have sought to maintain their territory so they could survive. But I think it's worse in the way Howard Zinn presents it, because for the Europeans, it was motivated by capitalism. So anything that's motivated by capitalism is ipso facto worse. So he has to present it that way. So he does try to, give a sort of appearance of objectivity, a quick acknowledgement. He does that in several places. But then the overwhelming amount of, words devoted to his argument is against the Europeans. So he kind of mentions it, goes along, and then he says, but, what the Europeans did was far, far worse. They were motivated by greed, whereas, the Indians were always, it was always kind of innocent. So,
and that gets us to another point that you mentioned early on in the book. So we maybe just talk about Howard Zinn for just a minute, because he was using a Marxist worldview. Now, whether he was a Marxist or not, we can have that debate all day. But he was bringing that kind of economic look, and capitalism bad, socialism good, Marxism even better. And so that runs through those writings as well, and looks at everything from a kind of a Marxist worldview and even an economic worldview, doesn't he?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, on probably the best authority that I have, which is the historian Ron Radosh, who was a member of the Communist Party for a brief period in his own life, looked at Howard Zinn's FBI files and concluded that he was a member of the Communist Party from about 1948 to 1953, when he officially dropped his membership. He did that because, like many other communists at the time, he wanted to go and infiltrate the institutions. And in his case, it was academia, it was education. So he wanted to transform the thinking of young people. He wanted to radicalize them. So that was his motivation. And, as I point out in a few places in the book, his people's history bears remarkable similarities to William Foster's book, Outline Political History, which was published in 1951. And yes. Foster, of course, was the CPUSA chairman at the time.
Let me take a break, because I have one of those breaks, but I want to talk about that connection, and it's an important one, but we have one of those mandatory breaks. Okay. And again, if you are just joining us, we've been talking with Dr. Mary Grabar about Debunking Howard Zinn. It's published by Regnery, and we have information about it in case you would like to get it either in hardback or paperback, or eventually paperback eventually, but also in Kindle. And it is all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation about this very significant influence in American history in English and all of our education right after this.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about this very significant and influential book, Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. Of course, there's a children's version of that as well. And as I've said before, if you have young people that around the dinner table maybe are taking a class in civics or history, saying some things, you go, well, that doesn't sound right. Or you're wondering why so many young people today think that socialism is better than capitalism, that maybe they challenge this idea of American exceptionalism, or maybe you have a young person or a grandchild coming home from college saying some pretty unusual things. A lot of that goes all the way back to this book by Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States, which is why we have Dr. Mary Grabar on talking about her book, Debunking Howard Zinn. And in just a minute, I do want to get into the whole issue of America, racism, slavery, and the rest. But you were talking about the communist connection to Howard Zinn. And if we don't get to those other chapters that you have on writing the Red Menace out of history, Ho Chi Minh and Howard Zinn and the commies win, it does explain a lot, because he was promoting a communist Marxist idea. And so anybody that was challenging that, and that would certainly be a lot of things that happened during the 1950s, for example, is written in a way that probably is not fair. So you can see that knowing his connection to the Communist Party, knowing his Marxist outlook, helps explain a great deal of what's in his book, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly does, and he is simply going by the communist playbook. He's doing it in an updated manner. I mean, if you notice his book, he's using a lot of 1960s lingo. You know, he's always referring to the establishment and the system. He also uses the term Negro, which, by 1980 was certainly considered to be offensive, but he's still stuck in the 1960s, and so what his genius, his evil genius was to update what William Foster wrote, which of course didn't go beyond, the Communist Party member reading groups, and to write something that would be emotionally engaging and appealing to young people and present it as a legitimate history book so it would be used in classrooms, and it was written to be used as a textbook, and it actually did work. I mean, it's been adopted. It's you mentioned the young people's history of the United States. That is being used in all 8th grade classes in Portland, Oregon, where I'll be speaking in January. Those poor, 8th graders are subject to a young people's history of the United States, and it's absolutely horrible. It, it tries to subvert the authority of parents and of teachers and of the traditions. So, and the other thing that Howard Zinn was doing was continuing the communist project of sowing discord between the races. And they did that, and that was an objective that was expressed in the early 1920s because they saw that as a weak point, and it was. There was segregation in the South, there was discrimination, there was racism, and the communists exploited that and presented themselves as being the only people willing to help African Americans, which of course is patently false, and as a matter of fact, they were harming them. And as I point out, in the Scottsboro case where 9 young men and boys were accused of rape, they actually prolonged their imprisonment and were hoping to get martyrs, and so they could, so the communists could rail more against the United States. But Howard Zinn does that. He does that. He downplays or doesn't really mention the NAACP and falsely presents a few black communists who were the ones who, were the true heroes, and of course the Black Panthers as well.
Let's say we can maybe spend some time talking about, especially that one chapter on Americans invented racism. If you can kind of summarize it, it's 2 points. Number one, Americans invented racism. There wasn't any racism until America. And number two, capitalism led to slavery. It's the only reason we had slavery in this institution is because we had capitalism. And if that doesn't cause most of our listeners to shake their head going, really? Is that what was being presented? I think that's a quick, but I think relatively fair summary of some of the material in his book. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yes, and it's, and as with the other point about the Aztecs, Zinn does admit that there was slavery in Africa, but it was more like the feudal arrangements in Europe. They were more, the slaves were treated like family in Africa, which is, false. And so, but the worst kind of slavery was in the capitalist countries, was in America, because greed motivated it. Slaves were worked to death. They weren't treated like human beings. And so with the slavery in America came racism, because once the slaves were seen as, subhuman, to be exploited, along with that came this hatred based on race. And so, here is where racism was invented. That's, I think, the gist of his argument, which of course is completely false. There has been racism and slavery since time immemorial, and it wasn't, the sort of relationship that you would have under a feudal system. It was brutal. It was often more oppressive than in America. So that is all false.
Let me take another aspect of that, because, again, young people reading Young People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn's book, are going to be treated to the fact that how awful slavery was. Don't disagree. But what seems to sometimes get eliminated is the fact that this nation addressed that issue, and that the abolition movement, which gets short shrift for sure, of coming from Christians, for example, and the Civil War and the attempts to try to address some of these issues simply kind of gets left aside. And so we jump from slavery then to Jim Crow laws, and there's never a sense in which this is a nation that did engage in an evil practice, but did what it could to try to rectify that. Is that fair?
Yes. That's exactly what he says. And, the Civil War, he says, was not fought to eliminate slavery. Lincoln did not free the slaves. Lincoln was part of the whole system of American presidents that tried to, gain territory and power, and those were his motivations. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, comes from, this very poor background, and a very complex and a very moral.
I think I just lost you. Do we still have you? I think we lost her, so we'll see if we can get her back. But again, we're talking about the book, Debunking Howard Zinn, and we'll see if we can get her back in just a minute. But we've been talking with Dr. Mary Grabar, and something that we can address in just a minute is, again, the book, which is available perhaps in your local bookstore, but if not, you can probably find a good example of that on our website, pointofview.net. It's available both in hardback and in Kindle, and we'll get her back after the break. But let me just mention that this particular book has about 300 pages, just all sorts of footnotes. And again, you might be saying, why are you spending an entire hour on this book? Because it's become more and more obvious to me as I've gone back and looked at a lot of these history books that this was the book that kind of stimulated a lot of other individuals to write textbooks that can be used. And of course, as you just pointed out, There are school districts in this country right now that actually require kids to read a young people's history of the United States. For those of you watching online, I'll hold up again a People's History of the United States, which again is just one of those resources that is available. And of course, I got mine at Half Price Books, and it's about 700 pages. We're just covering two of the aspects of that, the whole issue of Indians, Native Americans, and slavery. But there are so many more things about the robber barons and the trusts, of course, the whole issue of the Civil War, going on even then to the issue of the real conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, the so-called Red Menace, a whole section there on everything from the Vietnam War, then, of course, the attempt to impeach Bill Clinton, all the way up to the War on Terror. So there's just a lot of things we won't cover. But if you want to understand why some of these ideas come out of the mouths of your kids and grandkids, a lot of it comes from this book. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
A few more minutes talking with Dr. Mary Grabar. Again, the book is entitled Debunking Howard Zinn. We've talked a little bit about the Native Americans. We've talked about racism, kind of jumped ahead a little bit, talking about rewriting and writing the Red Menace out of history. But I thought we kind of skipped over one chapter. I thought I'd just mention briefly because it illustrates, again, how unfair Howard Zinn was in terms of history. And it's your chapter on casting a pall on the finest hour. And this is, again, maybe an explanation for why we see even young people today that have no respect for people in the military because let's take at least one war, World War II, which seems to be a very moral war. But again, if I can summarize Howard Zinn fairly quickly, he makes no distinction between the United States and Nazi Germany. America and Hitler are almost the same, and he comes to that position by ignoring all the good that we were able to accomplish by fighting that war, mentions the difficulty that black soldiers faced in the military, which some is partially true, basically compares the internment camps actually implemented by Roosevelt in California for Japanese individuals to the, if you will, the Holocaust, and on and on. And this, again, maybe to me, Mary, explains a little bit why today we don't have the great respect for some of the greatest generation apart from the young people, because if this is their perspective about World War II, why would they respect those individuals that fought against Nazi Germany and fought against the Japanese imperialism?
Yeah, it's, in Howard Zinn's casting, it's part of the fault of the United States, that things got to the point where they did. He doesn't mention the Nazi-Soviet pact. The internment camps, it was just, some of this research was, pretty basic. He says that, that the internment camps were kept secret from the American people until September 1945, when an article appeared in Harper's Magazine. And so he kind of likens it, to actually what the Russians were doing, the Soviet Union, which is sending people to the gulags there to, be overworked and die, out of sight. But all I did was go to Harper's Magazine, and there in 1942, 4 months after the order was given, a reporter had gone out to one of these facilities and described what it was like there. And he said, that it was not a concentration camp, that the facilities were clean, the food was adequate, that life was not like that at all. And I went through some of the, some of the newspaper reports. So Zinn just, flat out lies about this stuff. And it's quite ironic because at the time, he was a young man, and he would have been, hearing about this. So he knew firsthand that this was no secret and that these were by no means anywhere near the concentration camps, of Nazi Germany or, of the gulags. So, by making those moral equivalences, he presents the U.S. as being fascist, and he even, uses this kind of creative phrase of saying that, fascism was in the victor's bones, the victorious allies, because, of course, they were capitalist. And so it's all very creepy. And the other thing he does is that he uses as one of his sources a Holocaust denier.
No, it's just amazing.
It's amazing. It truly is amazing what this man has gotten away with and how much money this has earned and how this book is believed by teachers, by the general public. But it's all communist disinformation.
Well, and let's just take a good example. A while back when we had these migrant detention camps, you had a number of individuals refer to them as concentration camps. And people say, where does that come from? Well, it comes from Howard Zinn's book, because he compared the Japanese internment camps to concentration camps. So these ideas and these rhetorical flourishes come from books like this and then get used by even members of Congress and pundits and things like that. So this is, I know why you wrote the book, because I would again say that if I were to go outside of the studio right now and ask individuals, have you ever heard of Howard Zinn? They go, no. I doubt that you'd get a percentage of people that would know who he is. But if you then started mentioning all the ideas that he has been able to place in the heads of young people, you might have a light go on and say, well, no wonder they don't like capitalism. No wonder they want socialism. No wonder they think America's an evil empire. No wonder they are critical of all the things that have been done in the last couple of years because of some of these ideas. So I know that's exactly why you wrote the book.
Yes, and I would like to add a positive note. The things that he leaves out, and you had mentioned, the Indians, and one of the things I note here, and I got this from a sort of an encyclopedia about Indians, is that they served very honorably in World War II.
Yes.
To the contrast of what Zinn says, they were proud of their warrior skills. They brought their own rifles to the induction centers, and at that monument, at Iwo Jima, you have a Pima Indian there. You also, in the civil rights movement, he overlooks E.D. Nixon, who was a Pullman porter, who was the mastermind behind the Montgomery bus boycott. So all these people who have, had faith in the American dream, who were patriotic Americans, are just, pushed aside, ignored, and people of their group, whether they're Indians or African Americans, are all presented as helpless victims who are waiting for the communists to come and save them. The communists, by the way, who are mostly all white. So it's quite ironic.
Well, again, the book is entitled Debunking Howard Zinn. We have a link to it. Of course, you can also order it from Regner, but we've made it real easy for you to get the hardback or Kindle. About 300 pages. And Dr. Mary Grabar, I appreciate you writing it. I appreciate you giving us an hour today. I hope we can maybe cover some more topics in the future. And, of course, almost every time I turn around, I find one of your articles addressing one of those issues. So it has been very helpful for you to be on the program. And so thank you for writing the book, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you for having me.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll move off of this subject of history, although I could spend hours on this, as you probably figure out, and I think it is really important to recognize that these ideas have consequences, and these ideas have ended up in the heads of your children and grandchildren. So that's why I wanted you to know where they come from and know that there are answers to those, which are available through some of the books and resources we make available. But when we come back, I want to change topics for a while and spend a little bit of time talking with Dean Inserra. His book is entitled The Unsaved Christian. What does he mean by that? Well, we know during the Christmas holidays, we oftentimes will have somebody show up at church. They think they're a Christian, but as you get to know them, I mean, only God knows for sure, but they just think they're a Christian because they went to church occasionally, but they've never really made a profession of faith. And how do we interact with these cultural Christians? I think he's going to give us some real insights, especially during this Christmas season. The kind of people that show up at Christmas and Easter, but you never see them any other time. So we'll be talking about that with him right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, during the Christmas season, oftentimes we see some individuals show up at church we haven't seen all year. Maybe they come at Christmas and Easter, and maybe a few other times. But this is the whole phenomenon of cultural Christianity, which is why this book I thought would be very helpful at this time of year. The Unsaved Christian, Reaching Cultural Christianity with the Gospel. And so I thought you would really enjoy this conversation. It's one we've had before about individuals who think that they're Christians. But, and again, we'll only leave that to the Lord to figure that out. But oftentimes, as you get to know them and you don't see any kind of change in their life, you wonder about that. And they may just think they're Christians because, after all, I grew up in America. I went to church a few times, so I must be a Christian. And so I think you're going to really appreciate this conversation we're going to have now with Dean Inserra. He's a graduate of Liberty University, holds a master's degree in theological studies from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, good friends up there in Kansas City, pursuing a doctorate of ministry from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, founding pastor of City Church, and an individual that really brings a great deal of insight to this conversation about cultural Christianity. So, Dean, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be with you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
One of the things you do early on is talk about meeting a fellow seminary student who was heading to California. And I might just mention that we broadcast all over the nation, so we have listeners in Florida, we have listeners in California, but you're talking about the fact that you're going to go back to your hometown of Tallahassee and thinking, well, you know, that's going to be really something because I'll be able to minister to Christians. But look at this guy. He's going to Northern California, and that's kind of one of the more secularized regions of the country. And yet what was so interesting is he said, you know, if anything, Dean, I want to say the Bible Belt is the most difficult place in America to pastor a local church. And the reason for that, and I'd love you to talk about that, is that you have a lot of people that show up in a southern church. We have listeners in Florida and Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi. You can go all the way through the South, who say, well, I must be a Christian because, after all, I've gone to church, or maybe even walked an aisle one time, maybe even held up a hand, maybe even prayed a prayer. But you don't see any difference. And so in some respects, that's very different, because when you go to California, or each year I tend to go to two of the most secular places in the country, Oregon, because I teach up there, and Vermont, because I teach in New York. Those are the places where they can't even imagine that there would be a traffic jam at noon on Sunday around some of these churches. And so in some respects, the divisions are a little more obvious in other parts of the country, but not so much in places where cultural Christianity is really found a place of residence, right?
Oh, exactly, because what makes it complicated in the Bible Belt is there's confusion sometimes over who's a Christian and who's not. You don't find that in more secularized areas. And the point my friend wanted to make for me was where he was going, again, everywhere is hard, because we believe the enemy is everywhere, but where he was going, there was no confusion over who's a Christian and who's not. Either you follow Jesus or you don't. There's a clear starting point for evangelism and for gospel conversation, and that starting point was unbelief. Or if you talk to somebody maybe from another one of the world's large religions, there's a clear starting point. It could be maybe what the Quran teaches compared to what the Bible teaches. There's a starting point. In the South, there's so much confusion over who's a Christian and who is not, so there's really no clear starting point for a conversation with somebody who claims to be a Christian, but their reason for believing they're a Christian has nothing to actually do with Jesus and the good news of the gospel.
Sure. And I think I might just point out that even though we've just used the example of the South versus the rest of the country, I have found people even in parts of the country that wouldn't necessarily be seen all that Christian. You still run into people who think, well, I'm probably a Christian. And so it brings us to our first chapter in your book, Help Them Get Lost, the case for reaching cultural Christians. You have a lot of individuals, not just in the South, but all over the country that say, I'm good. You know, if you talk about the gospel, they say, I'm good. Well, that's the first starting point because they think they're good. They say, I haven't killed anybody. I'm certainly better than the guy down the street. So in some respects, you have to get them lost before you get them saved. True?
Oh, definitely. And what's happening there is they're doing what I call making the wrong comparison. And I say the answer is, I just call it changing the comparison game. When we compare ourselves to other people, we can always find somebody maybe a little worse than us by American standards. And it's not even individuals. We just compare ourselves to just culture at large. As long as we are living our lives in step with whatever suburban values looks like in 2019 where you live, then you feel like you're a pretty good guy, pretty good lady, whatever it might be. But when we compare ourselves to God, we fall short every single time. When we compare ourselves to God, we realize that we're sinners in need of forgiveness, in need of God's mercy, who deserve God's judgment for sin. A cultural Christian has no category for that, because a cultural Christian is basically a generic or vague theist, kind of a big guy upstairs sort of mentality. So if you believe God to be generic, then your sin you don't even view as sin. It's just making a mistake, messing up, something along those lines, and you don't have any consequences in your mind for that, because God's kind of a distant force or a moral compass or imaginary friend. But someone who actually does know the Lord, because God does make himself known. He's not vague. He's not generic. He makes himself plain to us, who he is through the Scriptures. Of course, we don't know everything about him, but we know everything he wants us to know about him through the Bible. When we worship that God, then we realize our sins are a really big deal, that God's going to deal with that sin, and that then points us to a plea for God's mercy, which we know is realized in the good news of the gospel. So that's what's going on in cultural Christianity, is by being a Christian, they simply just mean they're not atheists and they're not Jewish or Muslim. Their answer to why they're a Christian actually has nothing to do with Jesus, even though they claim to believe in him, admire him, whatever it might be. It's not a saving faith.
Sure. Let's talk about some other aspect that's maybe even broader than just the cultural Christian for a minute, because you talk about this idea of generic faith that demands and asks nothing of its followers. You run into more and more people that say, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Or, I'm a none, none of the above, atheist, agnostic, no preference. And so in some respects, we're running into even a kind of a phenomenon now where individuals still feel good about themselves. They don't see a need for the gospel because they don't really see how religion is relevant to their life. But they will come back and say, well, I have sort of a generic faith. I have a spirituality. I'm a spiritual person, but not a religious person. And in some respects, your book will help reach those kind of people too, won't it?
Yeah, I hope so. We can make it clear that spirituality doesn't forgive sin. Jesus forgives sin, and we got to be honest about that. We got to be unafraid to have those kind of conversations.
Right.
I know you don't think you are, and I don't think I am the authority on who's a Christian and who's not, neither any of our listeners, but the Scriptures are. And we got to make sure that we really do believe that salvation comes through Christ, not the idea of Jesus, not the admiration of Jesus, but actually faith in what Jesus has accomplished for us that leads us by God's kindness to repent of our sins and believe the gospel. So I think it's absolutely critical for us to realize that a vague spirituality is not what it means to follow Jesus. Like, we have an object of our faith, and it's Christ.
Right.
So we have to be very clear about that. Our faith has a clear, defined object, and that is Jesus and his work on our behalf. There's no vagueness. There's no random spirituality. It's Christ. And the cultural Christian, again, it's fine with Jesus, but it's not the Jesus of the Bible who demands our lives, who calls us by his grace to pick up our cross and follow him. That's just not how it works for someone whose faith is defined by their heritage or their belief, morals, or tradition, or something along those lines.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, what about this idea of false assurance? Some individuals say, oh, no, I prayed that prayer a long time ago, or I walked an aisle. What about that? We're going to get into that issue as well with Dean Inserra. The book is entitled Unsaved Christian, and it is just out, published by our friends at Moody. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The marriage rate in America has been in decline for many years. Consider that in the year 2000, the married 25 to 34-year-olds outnumbered their never married peers. By 2015, however, those percentages were almost reversed. Young people are not getting married for a variety of reasons. Many economists argue that men are avoiding marriage because they have lower wages and want to increase their income before asking a woman to marry them. But the latest research shows that even where wages have increased dramatically, we see no appreciable change in marriage rates. Another theory is that men are fearful of commitment. Obviously, there's some truth to that, but again, we find surveys that show that men plan to get married but are content to postpone marriage. The median age of marriage for American men is now approaching 30. Sociology professor Mark Regnerus at the University of Texas has published research that explains why men are postponing marriage. It can be summarized in 2 words: cheap sex. As compared to the past, he says, many women today expect little in return for sex in terms of time, attention, commitment, or fidelity. Men do not feel compelled to supply these goods as they once did. He also adds one other explanation: pornography. Online porn, he says, has made sexual experience more widely and easily available too. A laptop never says no, and for many men, virtual women are now genuine competition for real partners. When many of us were growing up, we sometimes heard our mothers or grandmothers warn young girls about giving themselves away. They ask, why buy a cow when you can get the milk for free? This recent study confirms what they were telling their daughters years ago. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dean Inserra, founding pastor of City Church, and again, author of the book, The Unsaved Christian. It is published by Moody. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to order it in paperback or Kindle, and it addresses the whole issue of reaching to cultural Christianity with the gospel. Well, we've been actually doing some preaching. Now we're going to go into meddling, I suspect, because we're going to talk about in Chapter 6, false assurance. And then we're going to talk about this idea of country club church and church membership. But let's get into this one because, again, one of the things we run into, Dean, is that maybe you're going to have somebody sitting next to you at church. If they're coming because they wanted to get near church during the Christmas season, you get talking to them and you're not sure that they're saved. Some of the things about their language, their dress, their lifestyle kind of raise questions. And so you say, well, you know, have you ever accepted Jesus Christ? They go, oh, yeah, I walked an aisle when I was 4 years old and I was baptized or something like that. Or, you know, I was at a youth group and they asked, how many of you have accepted Christ? And I put my hand up. You're a little more concerned about the fact that some of the, if you will, the systems kind of lead to what you call system failure. Explain, if you might.
Yeah, well, what's happened in a lot of sort of, I guess, revivalistic type circles is that we have sadly made the gospel simply the question, who wants to go to heaven when you die? Well, if you ask the question, who wants to go to heaven when you die, who's not going to raise? I think atheists just raise their hand, right?
Yes.
So that's not the gospel. That's a great benefit of the gospel and a great blessing of the response to the gospel. That's not the gospel. So we've basically have made the gospel, who wants to go to heaven when you die? And then the result of that, we've said, okay, great. If that's you, repeat this prayer after me. So we basically have done is, again, we've made the gospel, who wants to go to heaven, and then we've made the way you get there, basically putting on your ruby red slippers with Dorothy and saying there's no place like home, you know, kind of kicking your heels together. where the gospel is actually spending your life. It's responding to the gospel invitation is responding to the person and work of Jesus, not just some call to go to some place called heaven when you die. They don't even give much definition around. So I think the way the system has failed us is it's all been done simply for decisions rather than for disciples. And I'm a really big believer in eternal security. I mean, I believe in the perseverance of the saints and that once saved, always saved. I believe in those things with all my heart. However, there's a caveat to that. I want to make sure people actually are saved. I don't think you can lose your salvation. I think a lot of folks never had it. And I think it goes back to a belief system before it goes back to anything else, where they never have actually really surrendered to Christian convictions. They've simply surrendered to a moment at time or just said some magic words and believe they're saved because of that. We just have to be really careful. I'm all for the sinner's prayer, but just make sure people see it as a tool to share the gospel, not the way you get saved. Where we get saved is actually by Jesus. Like our assurance is in a person and what he's done for us. It's common to hear things, especially in the South, like if you don't know the time of the day, that in the moment when you were saved, you might not be. I just don't see it in the Bible. My assurance of salvation is not in a moment. It's in Christ. You know, and he's accomplished for me. See, a lot of folks making, I'm holding quote signs in the air quotes, decisions. The decisions are more to don't go, it's basically some kind of call to who wants to go to heaven and say these words rather than a decision to actually follow Jesus. So I think got to be very careful with that.
I just mentioned, too, that you've got 15 chapters here, so this would be a great discussion guide for individuals because you have a section at the end of each chapter on questions for discussion and reflection. So this could be something that not only could individuals read, but people that are maybe in a small group or a Bible study wanting to be a little more effective to reach out to the so-called cultural Christians in their environment will be helpful. But let me take on a couple more because, again, we won't cover all the chapters, but one of those is about this idea of lax church membership, because you argue that fosters this idea of cultural Christianity as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, because you're asking people to be a part of a church that doesn't mean anything to actually be a part of it. I had to answer the question early in our church's existence when we first planted it years ago. Somebody said, if I become a member on Sunday, what changes on Monday? And I had no answer. And the reality is that's how church membership works for a lot of people. You don't even know the people, don't even know their story. Don't even know they stand with the Lord, and they'll just sign up to be a member, or raise their hand, or come forward, something along those lines. Or being where trusting in Jesus should be easy. Now, following Jesus is hard, but trusting in Jesus should be easy. Joining a church shouldn't be. It should actually matter. And how we can really, I guess, allow cultural Christianity to thrive is when we have churches where membership means nothing. So I call it country club churches. And a lot of times when you hear country club, you think snobby, or pretentious or snooty. That's not what I mean by that. I mean more churches where all you have to do to be a member is just pay your dues. Like it doesn't mean anything, that they just want you there. So we can have people join our churches willing to know they stand with the Lord. There's no accountability for their lifestyles. There's nothing that changes after that. Like we're allowing cultural Christianity to flourish. Oftentimes not even realize they are meaning to.
Wow.
So membership should matter for all of us. It should have significance behind what it means to be a member of our churches.
Let me take on one other issue just before I let you go, because, again, this book is just chock full of great information. But you mentioned this in the area of Chapter 3, but then it shows up again in Chapter 11. And it's something we've talked about before. Christian Smith, who we've quoted from oftentimes here, talks about the fact that especially among young people in his study, concluded that they adopt kind of what's called moralistic therapeutic deism. And by that, they mean moralism and that, well, that is, I have to be good. Therapeutic, well, the Bible is all about what it means to me. And deism, well, God started the universe, but he really isn't concerned about me in the day-to-day life. And this book is helpful not only for the adults that are cultural Christians, but I think it's absolutely crucial because we have a whole generation now that really don't believe the gospel per se, but have really adopted this idea of moralistic therapeutic deism. And since you addressed that in a couple of chapters, I wanted to get your thoughts about how to address that issue as well.
Yeah, I think it also goes back to what we talked about earlier, the generic and vague God. Yeah, a generic or vague God is going to give me just enough spirituality to live out my, values that I claim to have and to still feel like I'm spiritual. This moral theistic deism, it's not the gospel. It doesn't call for any change in my life. It doesn't put a cross or resurrection in front of me. Rather, it just kind of gives me just enough basic theistic of kind of a hat tip, towards God, or kind of a thumbs up, and maybe false assurance that he's there, or that I know him, or that I'm connected to him, when really the reality is it's no different than the God of the old-time theism that's foreign, that is nowhere near us, that doesn't really care about the affairs of our lives, when we believe that God cares about every detail of our lives. Again, we got to understand about cultural Christianity. There's one thing I want to drive home I haven't said yet. It is that this is not a discipleship issue. And I think wrongly in the past, we've viewed cultural Christianity that way. We think it's just people who need to get their act together, get more serious about Jesus, things like that. Cultural Christianity is not a discipleship issue. It's an evangelism issue. It's a different religion altogether. And it's this very vague, kind of vague theistic kind of belief that just assumes as long as you live your values and have some sort of spirituality that you're a Christian. But notice their answer to being a Christian has nothing to do with Jesus. We just got to make sure that we're clear on these things. There's a huge mission field in front of us, people who think they're Christians, and the reason for believing that is simply because they're not atheists.
Wow.
That is not a saving faith. James said, you believe in God? Okay, even the demons believe in that, and they shudder.
And let me just real quickly say that as we wind down this interview, the book Unsaved Christian is certainly valuable in terms of the 15 chapters, but I think one of the great values is the appendix, and that is you identify really 8 different types of cultural Christianity. We've talked about the country club Christian, and we can talk about moralistic therapeutic deism and all sorts of others, the Bible Belt Christian, the mainland Protestant, generational Catholic, on and on and on, and you really take on and explain each one of those types, give a profile, some of the mistakes, a gospel conversation starting point, and some other material. So if nothing else, Dean, I wanted to feature this, especially as we're coming into the Christmas season, where a number of people show up in the church that we haven't seen for months, maybe even in years, and see this as an opportunity to reach out to them. And for those of you that head up a small group study, maybe have a Bible fellowship, a Sunday school class, this is written in such a way that there is a section at the back that actually has some questions for discussion and reflection. The book is published by Moody Press, and it is written by Dean Inserra. And Dean, I appreciate you joining us, and I really appreciate you writing this book because it is so needed, and I really appreciate the fact that you felt the need to write it, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, thanks so much for your interest in the book, and I hope it can help people reach our friends for Christ. So thanks so much.
Again, published by Moody Press. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but as you well know, you can simply click on the link there. You'll see his picture, and then if you click on it, it's a very inexpensive paperback book that I think you're going to find extremely helpful, and it's the kind of issue we're addressing. And certainly if you find yourself in the Bible Belt, that is the case. But then he's, of course, talking about all sorts of other individuals that aren't in the Bible Belt, but in one way or another have adopted a particular kind of cultural Christianity. And if you really want to be effective in sharing your faith and want to make sure that these individuals are actually saved, that's why I wanted to mention this book, especially during the Christmas season. Well, when we come back, we do have an impeachment inquiry. We'll talk about some of that right after these important messages.
So when people first hear about MediShare, they have questions, some good ones, like, what is it? Well, MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become MediShare members? 2 big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With MediShare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kerby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I would direct you, of course, to our website, pointofview.net. You'll find information about the book by Mary Grabar, as well as the book by Dean Inserra. And you will notice that we still have kept up the banner Giving Tuesday. Of course, this is now Thursday. The reason I kept it up, if for no other reason, is we had a $15,000 matching fund, and last time I heard, we still have not made the match. So I thought if anybody's out there saying, well, I didn't know that you had a financial need, maybe I could actually do something to put you over the top, I thought I'd leave it up there a little bit longer. Of course, we'll take it down tomorrow for our Friday weekend edition, but I just thought I'd mention, some people always ask, did you make the match? And oftentimes I like to put out an email saying we made the match, but I can't put it out yet. Maybe some more will come in the mail, but at the moment we haven't. So I just thought I'd mention that. And you can do what you want with that information. Okay, let's get into the articles of impeachment. It does appear that this is going to happen. I wondered if it might. The Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, stood in front of the press for all of 6 minutes, took no questions, simply said that sadly, with confidence and humility, with allegiance to our founders and our heart full of love for America, today I'm asking our chairman to proceed with articles of impeachment. She waited essentially one day. Yesterday we had day one of the second round of the impeachment hearings in the Justice Department, Judiciary, I should say, Judiciary Committee. And as a result, she said, we have no choice but to act. So that means we're headed for a vote, possibly soon, in the House of Representatives on the articles of impeachment. It will be interesting to see what those might be, because one of the things we learned yesterday is that some of these individuals that testified as law professors, first of all, had no firsthand knowledge, but made the case, as did Noah Feldman, a Harvard law professor, that the Founding Fathers would identify President Trump's conduct as the kind of abuse of office that would qualify for that. We had, of course, Dr. Pamela Karlan, who is from Stanford, who I just found out recently is actually was on the short list to be put on the Supreme Court. Let's hope not. I mean, this is where elections have consequences. But again, she's had a real history of attacking and criticizing the president, and claimed that, if nothing else, the president cannot see himself as a king. And I'll come back to that quote that got her into trouble in just a minute. But fortunately, in the midst of all of this, you had at least one individual, a Democrat, a person that supported Hillary Clinton, but nevertheless a liberal progressive Democrat, who is Jonathan Turley, who is a law professor at George Washington University, that at least tried to bring a little bit of common sense into there and really challenge the rationale of some of the Democrats on the committee for impeachment, and said, really, if the House, this is his direct quote, if the House proceeds solely on the Ukrainian allegations, this impeachment would stand out among modern impeachments as the shortest proceeding, with the thinnest evidentiary record, and the narrowest grounds ever used to impeach a president. And then even criticized the Democrats at one point, saying, look, President Trump has gone to the courts. He's allowed to do that, he was pointing out, as a law professor. We have three branches, not two. So if you impeach a president, if you make a high crime and misdemeanor out of going to the courts, and if that becomes an abuse of power, then you're guilty as well of an abuse of power. And so for just a minute, I thought I would quote real quickly from Fred Lucas 6 big moments from day one of the second round of the impeachment hearings. One of those came from Doug Collins, who is the ranking member in the Judiciary Committee. And he's from Georgia, by the way, I might mention. And he was saying that a lot of this simply had to do with sour grapes that Democrats had when, indeed, Donald Trump unexpectedly won the presidency. He said this didn't start with Mueller. This didn't start with a phone call. This started with tears in Brooklyn in November of 2016 when an election was lost. Then you had, of course, the whole question about, if we don't do an impeachment, aren't we just making Donald Trump a king? And I thought, really, can we just kind of cool the hyperbole a little bit there? Michael Gerhardt, who is a law professor from the University of North Carolina School of Law, said that if we don't impeach Trump, that would maybe raise the bar too high for future impeachments. I doubt that. If anything, we've lowered the bar, which we just alluded to just a minute ago, and I'll give more about that in just a minute. But let's come back to, again, one of the things that got Pamela Karlan in trouble, because she says the Constitution says there can be no titles of nobility. So while the president can name his son Baron, he cannot make him a baron. Well, everybody laughed, and everybody thought that was real cute. Melania Trump did not, and she said a minor child deserves privacy. She should be kept out of politics. Pamela Karlan, you should be ashamed of your actions. And anyway, very quickly then, Pamela Karlan came back during the hearing and said she wanted to apologize for that. Then you have the comment that was by Jonathan Turley, which was a little bit of levity, but it was used last night by all the late-night comedians, in which Jonathan Turley said, look, I get it. You're mad. The president is mad. My Democratic friends are mad. My Republican friends are mad. My wife is mad. My kids are mad. Even my dog is mad. And Luna's a golden doodle and has never been mad. Of course, they had a lot of fun with that last night, but it illustrates, again, how divided and mad everybody is becoming over these impeachment inquiry hearings. There were some things in number 4 about bribery and the definition, which I'll exclude. Also one that was used by Pamela Karlan, number 5, on what if, the president or any president would withhold funds after a hurricane in Texas or Louisiana until an individual did what he asked for. First of all, that's not what happened in the phone call. But second of all, I would put that in a different category. But it really leads to something I'd like to spend a few minutes on before we take our next break. And that was the remarkable interchange that took place between Representative Ken Buck, who is a representative from the state of Colorado, and Jonathan Turley, who, of course, is the George Washington University Law School professor. And so Ken Buck, first of all, wanted to try to clarify that if we use their definition, in other words, the 3 individuals, the 3 lawyers, the 3 law professors sitting next to you, if we use their definition, how would that play out in the past? And of course, the implication is how it would play out in the future. And so, first of all, Ken Buck says, Lyndon Johnson directed the Central Intelligence Agency to place a spy in election opponent Barry Goldwater's campaign. That spy got advanced copies of speeches and other strategies and delivered that to the Johnson campaign. Would that be an impeachable conduct according to the other panelists? And Jonathan Turley said, I assume. Oh, then Ken Buck asked, well, then how about when President Johnson put a wiretap on Goldwater's campaign plane? Would that be for political benefit? And Jonathan Turley said, I assumed I would. Then he gets into Franklin Delano Roosevelt because, interesting enough, Ted Dorsch of Florida, the Democrat, and talked about how President Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually put the country first. And he said, now, Franklin Roosevelt, when he was president, directed the IRS to conduct audits of his political enemies, namely Huey Long, William Randolph Hearst, Hamilton Fish, Father Charles Coughlin. Would that be an abuse of power for political benefit, according to these other panelists? And again, Jonathan Turley said, I think that would be subsumed with that. So then Ken Buck said, well, then how about when President Kennedy directed his brother, which would be Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to deport one of his mistresses as an East German spy? Would that qualify as impeachable conduct? And again, Jonathan Turley said, well, I can't exclude it. Ken Buck's not done. He's got another one. How about when Kennedy directed the FBI to use wiretaps on congressional staffers who opposed him politically? Would that be an impeachable conduct? And Jonathan Turley said, well, I would assume that it would be falling within that. Then he turns on to Barack Obama. Ken Buck says, well, let's go to Barack Obama. When Barack Obama directed or made a finding that the Senate was in recess and appointed people to the National Labor Relations Board and lost 9-0 at the Supreme Court, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg voted against the president on this issue. Would that be an abuse of power? And Jonathan Turley said, well, I don't see any exclusion under that definition. And so then Buck said, what about this one? How about when the president, and this would be Barack Obama, directed his national security director and secretary of state to lie to the American people about whether the ambassador to Libya was murdered as a result of a video or murdered as a result of a terrorist act. Would that be an abuse of power for political benefit 17 days before the next election? Jonathan Turley said, well, not according to my definition, but the others would have to respond on their own. And the implication of all of this, which is just unbelievable, is that indeed he was even saying that if you look at what Lincoln did during the Civil War, almost every president could be impeached based upon the definition that was given yesterday by the other three law professors, where at that point, at least Jonathan Turley said, well, I would hope that James Madison would escape. Otherwise, my lifetime of academic work would be shredded, because he's, of course, a real fan of James Madison. That's how it went yesterday, and I doubt you saw that covered by the mainstream press. But you heard it covered right here on Point of View. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We have a few more minutes. Let me just mention, no matter where you stand on this issue of impeachment, whether you think the president should be impeached or whether you think it's just a bunch of hot air and just want to move on, there is something that has surfaced from some of these investigations. First, the Mueller investigation, and now what's happened in the Intelligence Committee and now the House Judiciary Committee. And that is the concern that is raised by Victor Dafus Hansen about what happens when our guardians fail to guard the public trust. You know, the Roman satirist Juvenal said, who will guard the guardians? It's a good question, because I don't care whether you like the president or not, if indeed the deep state is now running amok and being able to do whatever it can without any kind of concern. This is one of the reasons why from time to time I do quote from Jonathan Turley. He's a Democrat, a progressive, an individual supported Hillary Clinton, but you can go and find some of the columns I've written in which he's expressed that the fourth estate, if you will, the bureaucracy, is kind of running on its own and doesn't seem to be accountable to anyone. And he uses some good examples in his article here. Let's take a couple. A couple weeks ago, we mentioned that there was an FBI lawyer that actually changed an email, altered an email, in order to get the FISA court, that's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, to post a warrant to surveil Carter Page, who was in the Trump administration. Now we're being told, and of course there's going to be a report from the Inspector General coming out on Monday, that it didn't change that. They probably would have issued the warrant anyway. I don't know, but I think that's just trying to cover their rear ends. But nevertheless, so we've got that allegation that already have an FBI lawyer changed an email and then falsely sent that to the FISA court. You have number two, you have James Comey, FBI director, who was fired, and we found out he leaked his own memos of private and confidential conversations with the president. Then number three, you have, of course, that amorous couple, Lisa Page and Peter Strzok, who were leaking memos as well. The argument is maybe it's not a felony, but we'll find out when some of the report comes out on Monday. Then, of course, you have Adam Schiff himself. I'm going to have a lot more to say about that in just a minute. But first of all, he claimed that, indeed, he had no relationship and his staff had no relationship with a whistleblower. We now know that's false. He read into the congressional record a version of the transcript, which was misleading. And, of course, that brings us to number five, I guess, the whistleblower himself, who first went to the House Intelligence Committee for guidance on how to lodge a complaint. Worked with a lawyer who is known as an anti-Trump activist who almost days after the inauguration called for a coup against President Trump. But the biggest concern is that now this 300-page report from the House Intelligence Impeachment Committee actually discloses details of telephone calls between the ranking intelligence Republican chairman, he's of course the minority chairman, Devin Nunes, and Trump attorneys Rudy Giuliani, Jay Sekulow, who's been on the program with us, reporter John Solomon, who used to report for The Hill, former Giuliani associate Lee Parnas, as well as the White House and many others. And so what you have is a report that is saying that we should not actually allow individuals to investigate this. And so in some respects in the report, Adam Schiff just kind of blatantly says, we are concerned about whether they're members of Congress that are complicit in this activity. And complicit in what, I think, is what our friends at the Wall Street Journal point out. Doing your job. I mean, Congress is supposed to get oversight. Talking to Donald Trump's lawyer about Ukraine to get a complete view of what was said and wasn't said. It's almost as if Adam Schiff is kind of just gone off the rails and thinks that not only should we impeach the president of the United States, but we should impeach all of these Republicans on his own committee. And how in the world is it that a sitting Democrat can get the phone records of all the Republicans? Well, we don't have to guess, because it turns out that Adam Schiff issued a subpoena back in September to AT&T demanding the call logs of those 5 numbers, including Rudy Giuliani's. Then there were subsequent subpoenas to AT&T and Verizon demanding more details. And you might say, well, why didn't we hear anything about that? Well, it's because Republicans, though they knew about that, under the rules of committee secrecy, weren't allowed to raise public objections. And so you may now be hearing about this for the very first time here on Point of View. We can go on, but first of all, Devin Nunes has the freedom to actually speak to whoever he likes. He has, but at the same time, Adam Schiff has no authority to investigate other members, to post the metadata disclosures for that. And yet that is taking place, and it's actually in the report. And instead of the mainstream press saying, wait a minute, this is a violation of privacy, you don't have the right to surveil these Republicans, instead they're treating this as if this is new information. But let's turn it around for just a minute. It wasn't so long ago that Republicans were in control of this committee. And imagine while the Republicans were in control of this committee, they were able to get all sorts of telephone data of, say, Adam Schiff and some of the other members of that committee. Do you think the mainstream press would be upset about that? Of course they would. I think the American people should be upset about this. And yet probably you're hearing about this today for the very first time because it simply isn't getting covered. If nothing else, hope that is a reason why you'll think about supporting Point of View, because we're trying to cover some things that just never seem to get mentioned. I'll see if some of the evening talk shows tonight bring it up, but I'm not going to hold my breath on some of that. We do have a couple other articles that you might want to see. One of those by Ben Shapiro, which I think does a very good job of criticizing and critiquing Paul Krugman, who is, of course, a Nobel Prize-winning economist at the New York Times, but nevertheless argues that the reason we have so much depression and suicide is because of all the conservative values in the red states. It's a bizarre piece, but again, you can read how he kind of dismantles it pretty quickly, not the least of which is when you look at a red state. Let's take the state of Texas, where I'm broadcasting from. You've got everything from liberal cities like Austin to conservative cities like Lubbock. Really? I mean, how can you even draw a conclusion from an entire state like Texas or anything else? More importantly, it really misses the point in a number of areas, and I wanted you to at least know there's an answer to that rather bizarre argument that people in red states are committing suicide and have more depression because of conservative politics. It's hard to even imagine somebody writing that, but I thought it would be good for you to know that there's a very good answer from Ben Shapiro on that. And my other piece that I've posted here comes from a survey that was done finding that 20% of left-leaning managers hiring individuals said they would not hire a Trump supporter. That's right. 1 in 5 say if we found out that somebody supported Donald Trump, we would not hire them for our company or for our business or for our outreach of whatever sort. And I think it, again, illustrates how, just turn that around. Imagine if you were to hear that a whole group of individuals, maybe 20% of maybe conservative hiring managers said, you know, we wouldn't hire somebody that supports Bernie Sanders because if they believe in socialism, probably bad workers. That'd be front page. That'd be a big story, wouldn't it? This story doesn't really get a lot of press, but it just illustrates again how the way in which some of this is covered only in one direction, and one of the reasons why we try to talk about some of this on Point of View. If you'd like to find some of those articles, they are available on our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to help us finish off our matching fund, it is available on our website as well. The banner says Giving Tuesday, and you can click on that button that says Give Now. And as you go there, I hope that you'll also find out a little bit more about some of these books that we've mentioned today by Dr. Mary Grabar as well as by Dean Inserra. I want to thank Andrew for his help behind the scenes as an engineer. I want to thank Steve for his help doing call screening and producing. Hope that you will join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
There's an old saying that the first casualty in war is truth. Maybe that helps you understand what's happening in America right now. Thankfully, it's not a war with bullets, but there is a war for control. Control of the country and control of your pocketbook. Truth is under fire, but you can help turn the tide by supporting truth. Join the Truth Team at Point of View Radio. Learn how you can make a difference at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Don't let truth become a casualty on your watch. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
So what would you do with an extra $500 a month in your budget? Pay off loans, save it, do something fun? Well, it's something you may need to think about if you become a member of MediShare. MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry, and it works. You can save big time on your healthcare costs, and you don't have to pay for things you don't believe in either. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40. 855-SHARE-40.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.